All right. So today we're going to be talking about third-party APIs and building out our backend API more with Django. Part one is going to be like why, we've already interacted with third-party APIs with the Rick and Morty API and the Pokemon API, and we've done it in the front end with React. Why do we want to do it on the back end with Django? We're going to look at the Noun Project API, which is another API that has just a little more setup because we'll actually have to create an account and get an authentication key. And we'll learn how to explore a third-party API, which is actually really important. A big part of being a software engineer is, especially as you grow it from like maybe a junior to a mid-level or senior engineer, like in year 2 or 3 of your career, like you will be researching libraries and like third-party providers or APIs, and you may have to figure out like, hey, can we use this and how much time might it take us to integrate it? Or should we use something else? And just even for your personal project, when you get there, by far, when folks, I think, run into sticking points with the personal project, it's because of unexpected issues with third-party APIs. So learning how to kind of explore and look at and de-risk third-party APIs is actually really important. We're going to see how to set up a third-party API with Django to have our backend make HTTP requests, and also how to handle API authentication keys and secrets, sensitive information that we don't want to put in the browser, because anything that lives in the browser can be gotten, right? We can look at the JavaScript code, we can inspect it. There's all sorts of things that can happen. I don't want the whole world to have, my, I don't know, Stripe Payments API key that we're using to handle payment processing. Part 2 of the lecture, we'll see how to kind of manage and format the data we get back from APIs. We're going to just dig deeper to adding some features with this, some things that the Noun API gives us we'll add to our Pokemon, and of course, writing some tests and how to simulate third-party APIs for tests. Because it's not always practical to actually have my backend hit the third-party API. Any questions about what we're going to cover today? Okay, awesome. So this is going to be good stuff. Third-party APIs, why? I think you all kind of have started to see the answer to this, right? If you want to find like the world's best resource on Pokemon data, the Poke API is pretty darn good. Same with Rick and Morty. And that's the essence of it, right? Someone else has gone to the trouble of collecting a lot of data in one place. And once we get with some third-party APIs, especially the ones that make us authenticate, we might be able to add information to that database. But APIs are also used for handling credit card payments, among other things. Like Stripe has an API and REST API and Docs. So if you want to integrate like PayPal or Stripe payment processing, just as one example, into your app, you do it by interacting with their API. So what does the API request flow look like for our Django app? Well, let's say that we're hitting some API and that's going to give us back pictures of stuff, right? And our React app over here, the user clicks on the button that says like, hey, give me a lamp app. And our code using Axios, we make a request to our Django API, right? And this is what we were going over yesterday. I apologize that my arrows are absolutely terrible. Maybe we have some data in the database, but for the lamp, maybe not. So we're not going to talk to the database. Django is going to, with this requests Python library that we're going to use, it's going to make an API call just like we were with Axios to some other third-party server in the cloud, right? Some other third-party API. They're going to talk to their database. And we don't have to know or care if it's a MySQL database, a Postgres database, or, a team of people on bicycles running around. Brandon, yes, sir.
Is there like a secret backdoor communication between Django backends? Like instead of having to serialize the data, could you just like if if receiving server is Django based, just pass the information directly kind of thing?
Unfortunately, no. Um, you absolutely can have different Django apps talk to each other. You would, in fact, still need to serialize the data. The
Okay.
serializer takes an object and turns it into a dictionary, right? And then we have other code that can take that Python dictionary and turn it into JSON and then send that over the internet. Because the way everything talks over a network essentially is with HTTP requests, which means if we're sending data, it's probably going to be in the JSON format. So they absolutely can talk to each other, but actually it's the same tools that we're using. And unfortunately, there's no secret Django Whisper network.
Damn. All right.
Yeah, it's a good thought though. So this other server, which very well could be Django, as you pointed out, or it could be something else. It talks to its database, it gets the LAMP image, it sends it back in the HTTP response. Our Django server does whatever we may want to do with it, but ultimately send the LAMP image back to the client in the browser. Right. Cody, yes, sir.
So I was looking at APIs to use for my project. What about APIs that send like emails to users in our database? So like there's an email sending API. I mean, you have to get the user from my database to get their email. Or would that API actually have my user in their database?
You are the first thing you said is correct. If over here in someone else's API, they're going to email our users, we probably need to give them that email address. And let me go ahead and clear these because now this is getting a little nuts. And guess how my application would give one of my users' email addresses to some other API.
Oh, I mean, I'm guessing it would pull my database.
Through an
So
API call.
oh,
The other API has a post. We would make up HTTP post request, right? Because we need to get the user's email in their database over here. Right. So maybe they have, post, cool API v1, your user email. And let's see if I can make this a little bit wider. There we go. And then in the body of that request, that HTTP request that we send, it would probably look something like this. It's JSON, right? Because everything communicates over APIs. So like we would make a post request to their API to give them our user's email, and then their code would do whatever the heck they want to do with it, including sending emails, maybe saving it to their database and so on. Does that answer your question?
yeah, yeah, it does. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, great question. Right. So really like REST APIs and HTTP requests and JSON, it's like the common protocol, right? Hypertext transfer protocol of how computers talk to each other over the internet. There are other protocols actually that are built under HTTP. HTTP uses the Internet Protocol and something called TCP, Transfer Control Protocol. But those are a little out of scope, and for most web applications, you don't have to worry about them. And WebSockets is an example of, I think, using one of these other protocols. So that's a bit of the why behind third-party APIs. Is basically this is how things talk to each other, right? This is how we can get data from someone else's API, and I don't have to think or worry about how their database works or anything like that. And so you can kind of imagine how we have like up here, oh, I'm so sorry. How we have up here, right, a Django. Let's try this one last time. How we have up here a Django URL path, right? But maybe that view function that we've been learning about, it's going to use this Python requests library that we'll use in a bit to make an HTTP GET request to some third-party API to get their data, right? And in fact, this massive, beautiful diagram over here, requests for humans, in a little bit we'll be using it. And in many ways, it's similar to Axios, but for Python. All right, and let me hop back over to where I want to be. So that's kind of the big picture of APIs. Let's take a little tour of the API we're going to be working with today, which is the Noun API. There's a couple things that go on with third-party APIs. Once you start providing an API as a service for the whole internet, you know, anyone on the internet can make an API call, and that potentially could be a bad thing, right? Like a malicious hacker could try to do what's called a denial of service attack, where they send like thousands of requests a minute to an API to overload it. So APIs on the public internet often require accounts, and they use that to enforce things like what's called rate limiting. And let's see here. Okay, I apologize. There was a work-related call, but it's something that I can tackle later. Right, because the Noun project doesn't want some teenager in their bedroom to just crash their server or cost them a lot of money. So for a lot of APIs, you have to sign up for an account. So you all will need to do this today and as we go on to use the Noun API. I've already created an account. I've just used my work Gmail, so I should be able to sign in, fingers crossed. And now I'm logged in. The Noun API is cool because, you know, if we want to find like fire, like say for a Pokemon move, we can find a lot of images of fire, right? And this is what we're going to be using the Noun API for here. Pricing, it's important to look at. A lot of APIs have free tiers for your personal projects. When you're looking at APIs, a lot of APIs their free tier will be very generous. They want people to use their API, right? So I'm on the free tier here. You should not, for your personal project, have to be paying for an API. Every now and then a student decides they want to, but pricing is something important to look at. And obviously, if you're evaluating different APIs, you know, for work, then pricing is really important to look at. The API docs is where, as developers, we want to hang out. And we see that there's a number of things over here. I've created, I think, an app or something from the last cohort, a playground account, as you can see that we never used. Because we can have different API keys associated with this, because maybe I'm using a lot of different applications. Oh, there's no interesting pricing there. And let's make one here for us now, just for X-ray, just for fun. And what this has done is it's generated an API key and an API secret. And this is a pretty common authentication encryption scheme called like public-private key authentication. I kind of sort of knew the math once, and I don't entirely remember it now. In essence, it's some math where if you have the public key, if you have my public key, but I have my private key. You can use my public key to encrypt a message and send it to me, and like I can decrypt it with my private key. So the public key, you know, is kind of okay to be shared and out there. The secret we don't want to share, and really you shouldn't ever show anyone this, but I'll just delete this later, and this is for learning purposes, so it's fine. The thing about these secrets and the key is, as you can see here, if I lose it, I have to regenerate it, which can be a pain. Excuse me. So for API keys and secrets, you generally want to keep track of them, and that's where like password managers and some things that we'll learn about more in a minute come into play. For now, just for the moment, just so I have somewhere to put them, I'm just going to copy and paste them into the README. Because sometimes, and I'm not sure if the noun project does this, but like sometimes they'll only show you like the secret once, and you need to write it down and save it somewhere, and they don't show it to you again. There's an API Explorer, which is very cool. And actually, let's go ahead and check this out. So up here, I can actually paste in my API key and secret and actually interact with their API and make real calls. And let's go ahead and do this and give this a shot and see what it looks like. Before we do that, I just want to point out their documentation, and as you work with APIs, you will have to read the documentation because each API might do things a little differently. And the noun API is pretty well documented, which is part of why we chose it. You can see it talks about how the noun API handles authentication, and OAuth is, I believe, an authentication scheme, and we're going to actually install a Python package to help with it. And they, again, link to some libraries to use. They have sample code that we'll look at in a second. You can see there's a little bit of information about making requests. There's the docs that we're about to look at in a moment. In fact, that we have with the API Explorer. And the documentation is pretty thorough. You can see here's a GET request and the path we have to use. A post request, the whitelisting and blacklisting is not really that important for us. It's really getting the icons that we care about. And we can see they give an example of what an HTTP request looks like and different options, different query parameters that we can add after this question mark, and an example of the JSON that it sends back, and that there's an awful lot of stuff here, right? There's a lot of metadata. And then there's the icon itself, information about who created the icon, links to the icon. So a large number of information and a number of different options and ways to interact with and work with this API. There's some documentation here around making requests, around pricing. In fact, there's some sample Python code that we'll come back to in just a moment. But let's go ahead and check out that API Explorer. And let me, in fact, grab my key. And secret. And put those things in. Right, and now if we go over here to icon, we can actually try this out. And let's try again, fire like we did before. So note how for this API, the way we search for something is after the question mark in the URL, we add what's called a query parameter, and it's query/fire, and we get a list of possible icon responses and tags. and there's a number of these. And we can actually limit maybe the number of responses we get back. So we just get one response back now. And they're giving us a URL that we could use to go to the next page if we wanted to kind of see the next fire icon in the list and so on. But for our purposes, we're probably not going to have to do a lot of pagination with the API library, but we can kind of see how it works. We can grab an icon directly if we know the ID. So if we scroll maybe through here, and here's some fire icon, and let's just grab its ID. So there's a number of different endpoints and ways to interact with this API to get data. And so here we see we've made a GET request, and the response has this common format with this metadata. There's icon, which is a JSON object. Right, and somewhere inside here, it's hiding way down here, is the thumbnail URL that actually has, this is the actual link to the image asset that we care about. So we'll have to dig through that JSON response to grab that. And then there's some other sort of response header metadata as well. But so this interactive documentation is really useful, as you can see. Something important to point out, note the V2 here. And in fact, if we go and we look at this API request that we made, we see API the noun project.com/v2, right? And over here as well. And I could put this in the browser. Oh, and in fact, it fails because I haven't set up authentication. So it's not working right now. But there is a V1 noun API out there. I don't believe you want to use that. That's a common point of confusion. You'll want to use V2. So kind of heading back to the documentation, we've seen how we can play around with it. And we've seen they give us some sample Python code. And this is where we're going to be going next, is we're going to use these two libraries that they recommend here, requests and requests OAuth for authentication. We see they've shown us how to set up authentication, how to construct a URL for our API call, and then make the request and get a response back. I just want to pause and see if folks have any questions or things that might be good to review before we start writing a little bit of code. Okay, awesome. Oh, Joseph, yes, sir.
So is that telling you to like hard code your API and your secret code, your API secret into your source code?
In that sample it is, but we are going to learn how not to do that in just a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is, you're absolutely right. They're showing this here. The expectation is the documentation is, they expect that developers sort of know how to do this stuff. So this is not a tutorial. This is more like a guide for someone with a bit of experience. Because you're absolutely right. Like hard coding this in the code is not ideal. And in fact, what's the problem if we hard coded this in our source code? Why is that potentially bad? Brandon, Nestlage, yes, sir.
Because of the evildoers.
What about the evildoers?
They're gonna DDoS all of our servers.
Potentially, but I mean, if it's in my code and it's my Django code, they don't get that in their browser. But what's the problem with having this in? And let me just make this a little more visual by actually putting it in our Django code. We're going to make a new app for this, but just for the purposes of discussion, let's throw this in like our view code. And let's just put this like right here. There's a different issue, but it is related to evildoers with having like API secrets hard coded in my source code. Len, yes, sir.
If this is working the way that I think it is, and there's a possibility of it going out in the clear, even if it's just over lines. And then when that happens, someone can intercept it and do a man in the middle attack. It also it might just be out there for someone to actually take control and get, just go in and start playing around with your data and not necessarily own it, but maybe you can sleep on your server, get, if it's financial information on there, get that information and then use that for other malicious stuff. And they don't even know you're feeding them. So
those are all real security risks, but those are not actually risks for this specific situation.
fair enough.
Yeah,
I don't know then.
But yeah, no, those are good thoughts. And honestly, all this security stuff is brand new. And I think the important thing is you all are thinking about it, right? The worst case scenario is like a software developer who isn't thinking about it. I see a couple hands up. In the interest of time, let me just share what I see as the biggest concern here and move on, but I appreciate the thoughts. So if this was in JavaScript code in the browser, many of the things you guys are mentioning would absolutely be risks. The real risk here is now that this is in the code, we're going to commit that code and push it to GitHub. And now we have on our GitHub like an API secret key, right? An API key and an API secret. And even if that GitHub repo is private, all the developers at the company can see it. And maybe someone there is malicious and it gets out, or maybe somehow that code does get out, though it's less likely. So that's for backend code, that's the real issue here is if this is here, hey, this gets checked into version control, or Len, as you mentioned, if someone, malicious got access to it. But that's the main thing. So we'll talk more about it later, but the main takeaway here is API keys and API secrets, you never want in your code at all, and you don't want it in your version control. Does that make sense to folks? Cool. Yeah, man in middle attacks and other things are more about like intercepting HTTP requests. This is a bit more about
well, like I said, it's plain text, right? You get the plain text file, and once you have the plain text key, you can do you can just do things, malicious things.
Let's ignore it and hash it up.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're gonna see how to not save this stuff in our version control. And in fact, let's go ahead and let's kind of get this ball rolling and start writing some code to build this up. And I think I'll leave this off to the side, and we'll come back to it. But we're gonna make a little Django app to set up some of this code. And we'll call it API app. And now that I've made the app, someone remind me, how do I tell Django that my new Django app exists? What do I have to modify in my code? Brandon, yes, sir.
In settings.py under installed apps.
Yeah, exactly. We have to add API app to the list of installed apps. And if I want, my API app to be able to handle HTTP requests and have endpoints, what do I have to set up in my Django code that we learned about yesterday so we can be like sending HTTP requests there? Murad, yes, sir.
Yeah, we can create the view.
Yep, we're gonna have to create the view. What else will we have to do once we create the view?
We need to create the URL inside the application first. Then we're gonna create the URL inside the project.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to start there just to walk us through that, and then we are going to create the view. Right now that we have this app, let's hook up our URLs PY so we can have some routing for it. And let's just call this noun. I know it doesn't match the name of our Django app, but it's for the noun project and it's for learning purposes. We do include, we give the Python module name, API app.urls. And now, Murad, just like you were saying, I have to go into the API app and create a URLs py file. And I'm actually gonna borrow a little help from, well, let's actually do this fresh. Let's go ahead and let's make a file. And it's gonna be URLs py. I am gonna grab just this line right here, these two things that we almost always want to use, path and include. And we're gonna need URL patterns equals path, and it's not gonna have any root for now. And let's, for now, we need to make the view, but let's call it maybe like noun project or something like that. And can someone remind me, what does this name property do that I'm adding here? Gary, yes, sir.
That you can use that as an alias.
Yeah, exactly. If I'm writing a test, I can do reverse noun project. And that gives me the URL. So I can do, really what I can do is I would do something like, remember from these tests, like self.client.get reverse noun project or something like that. So that I can get that path information without having to write out the full URL. And what is the full URL right now for this route? Right? We know it's going to be, localhost 8000. What's the rest of it? So the URL patterns sort of add on top of each other, right? And so because in that URLs py for the project, we added the path API/v1/nouns, noun. And in fact, I don't want to make the same mistake I made yesterday and forget the trailing slash, which caused a lot of pain points. Oh, and I'm sorry, let's bring that back so we can actually see it and get rid of the settings py. This is the full URL for this path, right? Because we've combined this. We've combined this on line 45 right here. With this, right? And if I came up with another path, like, I don't know, just something, it would be something, right? Does it, do folks have any questions about that? And is this ringing a couple bells from yesterday? Okay, hopefully yes. And we're going to be doing more stuff with this as we get going. But that's the key thing here, right? That this path here gets added on to this other one, right? Because it starts here, and then we tell Django, hey, then also add in the path rules from this other URLs py over here. And now that we've made this path, let me go ahead and let's start working on the view, and let's start installing the dependencies that we'll need. Where am I going to want to create this API view again? Well, here in the views py, right, for the API app. And I feel like that might not be the right import path. Let me quickly pull up our API view that we wrote yesterday from our Pokemon project in the Pokemon app. And indeed, I got my import path wrong. REST framework.views, REST framework.response. I'm actually just going to go ahead and copy these and paste them in. And I do recommend using your code you've written as guide code. And what method am I going to want to write inside this API view class? Most likely as a starting point. Murad, yes, sir.
Either get or post.
Yeah. So we're going to want to use get because we're not going to be adding data to our database. This is going to be an endpoint for getting data. And we're not going to be getting data from our database. We're actually going to be getting it from the Noun Project API. But so this is going to be a get request. Like every class method, the first argument needs to be self. The second one, because it's an API view, needs to be request for the Django HTTP request class. And we'll fill that out in a bit. But let's go ahead and let's install the dependencies that we need. I've been talking about this requests library and this requests OAuth So I'm going to go ahead and install those right now. And I've already got my virtual environment activated, so I should be good to go. So we're going to install requests. We're going to install requests OAuth as well. My requirements.txt is a level up. And I'm going to update my requirements.txt by doing pip freeze and piping it in the requirements.txt file. So it now has those new dependencies. And I know that I'm going to need to use requests in this API view because we're going to want to talk to the Noun Project API. So let me go ahead and import requests. And I'm getting the VS Code autocomplete, which is always a good sign. And from requests OAuth which handles the authentication, we're going to import OAuth1. And we do want to make sure to import OAuth1 as there's different kinds of like OAuth authentication schemes. And this is the one that we want to use. So again, just to recap, what we're doing here is we're writing code so that in, say, Thunder Client, I can do HTTP, localhost 8000, API, v1, noun, right? And maybe we're going to do something like this where we pass in the ID of something, or maybe we're going to give it a name, but we send this to our Django server. And then our Django server is going to talk to the Noun Project API. So I just want to check in with folks and make sure that that big picture piece of the puzzle makes sense and see if folks have any questions about it. Daniel, yes, sir.
I'm sorry. Why are we refreezing the requirements.txt? Could you reiterate that?
Yeah, absolutely. So just a moment ago, we installed some new dependencies for our project. This Python library requests to make HTTP requests, and we also did requests OAuth lib. Because I just installed them now, they're not in requirements.txt. It doesn't get updated automatically. So that pip freeze command gives me everything that I've installed in the virtual environment. So that does have the stuff that I just installed, right? So I'm updating requirements.txt with the new dependencies. Does that make sense?
Got it. So this is required for our Django to work, correct?
Django won't break, but when someone else clones your project and uses requirements.txt to install all of the different Python libraries we need, like this, which is sort of the standard convention for Django projects and for software generally. If you don't have a dependency in there, like the request library that the Django project needs, it'll break.
Got it. So whenever we are installing dependencies, make sure to update it. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. And by the way, other developers also includes like your future self in like 3 weeks. Because there's so much going on that you want to be able to come back to code that you worked on and have everything in a good, clean state and organized and have it laid out for you. Yeah, great question. So let's build out this API view and see it in action. So we have this sample code right here, and I am just going to totally sort of copy this guide code. We're going to set up our noun project API authentication. And we'll learn how to do this better, so this isn't hard-coded later. But for now, we're just going to do this the way it is. And let me quickly open up a split and go to the README, because this is where I have this stuff. So we need the key as the first argument. And then we need the secret as the second argument. And it's always good to double check that I didn't like miss a letter when copying and pasting, but I'm pretty sure I got everything there. So now we have the line of code we need for authentication for the noun project API with OAuth. When you're just getting started with an API, the best thing to do, and this is true of any tutorial when you're learning a new piece of technology, follow the tutorial and the sample code to the letter, because it works. Sometimes, I can't count the number of times I've changed just one thing because it should totally work. And then I realized I actually didn't understand enough about it yet. We just want to make sure that the authentication is up and running and that stuff works. So I'm going to literally copy their code. Brandon, yes, sir.
And this is a little out of scope, but I do think that it is related. So this OAuth, is this the same framework that is used for like when you go to a website and they ask you if you want to sign in with your Gmail or your Apple ID? Okay, cool.
That's a great
Okay.
question. It is not the same, but it has a very similar name. So that's called single sign-on. I don't quite know the implementation details. It can be done a number of ways. There is an authentication as a service company out there called Auth1 that has gotten their name from OAuth, and they offer single sign-on. So like I might sign up for an Auth1 account because they can make single sign-on easier. But Auth1 is a company. OAuth is an authentication scheme. Let's see the right way to describe this really. Yeah, an open standard authorization protocol. Yeah, OAuth is not specific to single sign-on, but it's probably used as a part of it. Yeah, that's a great question. Gary,
Yeah,
yes. Oh, yeah, Brandon.
I thought Google and Facebook, I thought they used OAuth as, but it's all good.
Yeah, I'm sure they do use OAuth. So OAuth is basically like a protocol or a set of rules of how we're going to authenticate. And you could think of that as like sort of the low level. And as part of single sign-on, where I can like sign on with my Google account or something else, they might be using OAuth authentication as a part of that. Gary, yes, sir.
Yeah, I was gonna say I see it a lot with the authenticator. So like if you're gonna go sign into Google or something like that, then they actually give you like a PIN.
Yeah.
And authenticator like generates a PIN like every like 60 seconds or something like that. and then you can utilize that PIN to sign on by using single sign-on, which is like your name and email. They use it a lot in crypto too.
Yeah, OAuth is it's pretty widely used. Part of the advantage of OAuth being an open standard is that the source code for like the actual authentication logic is publicly available and can be audited, particularly by cybersecurity experts. And that's kind of how like best practice for authentication security stuff works. You don't actually want like some secret authentication library, because unless you're like the NSA or the government, it's actually extremely hard to do authentication and encryption right. Because if you get one little thing wrong, the whole thing becomes vulnerable. So for the software industry, generally, like most encryption algorithms, like authentication protocols, follow some sort of open standard or practice, and you want to find the biggest, most popular, widely used one, used by lots of big companies, because it means it's had a whole lot of eyes on it, and it's well designed. And as we can kind of see here on the right, like OAuth gets used for all sorts of stuff by Google and other companies, and they probably use it as part of single sign-on as well.
Yeah, it's like two-factor authentication.
Yeah, that as well. Two-factor authentication is more about like how many different ways do we check that you are who you say you are. OAuth is more about if I have two computers talking to each other, how do I securely kind of make that connection and give that machine access and control that access. It's a little bit of a rabbit hole. It is interesting stuff though. I know a bit about the OAuth protocol, but not a ton. It does get pretty complex, but it is quite powerful. And here we're using it for a pretty straightforward use case. So we're about to authenticate using OAuth with the noun project API with our key and our secret. We've got the URL, right? The endpoint that we're going to test out. And let me actually pull their sample code back up. And we're just going to literally write out the code that they have here. And now we're using that requests library that we just installed. And we're going to make a GET request. We pass it the endpoint, the URL. Requests also needs to take as a second argument some authentication rules, right? So OAuth has, we can take a quick look at this code and see if maybe it describes what it did. Yeah, it basically uses the key and the secret to generate some sort of hash or number or something verifying that I'm who I say I am, and then requests pass this along, and it's some super long number that the noun API will look at, and because they also have like my key, they can verify that this is indeed coming from me and my account. And let's just print what we're going to get back. And let's go ahead and run this code. To do that, I need to run my Django server because I need to make the API call to my server. That's going to then make the API call to the noun project. And it looks like we have a typo, name error, noun project is not defined. This is an easy fix. Anyone want to tell me what I did wrong here? Eric, yes, sir.
You didn't import it?
Yeah, exactly. I didn't import it. So let me go ahead and do that now. From views, import noun project. So by the way, for learning purposes, it was good for us to write this out. But when I'm actually developing, my rule of thumb is like, I never write a line of code that's not actually valid and going to run. Like if I wrote this out, I would have like commented the line out. And then once this was implemented, come back and done it, because it only takes one or two kind of easy mistakes to make like that to have a much more challenging debugging situation. So I recommend as you write code, like always write code where you're keeping your program in a working state. Let's test this out with Thunder Client. And can someone remind me what URL should I make my GET request to test out my new API endpoint that I made for my Django server? Well, I know it starts with localhost and port 8000, but what do we want after that? Well, if we look at the URLs PY for the API app, Django app, there's nothing on this path, right? But then we use that here in the URLs PY for the whole project, API/v1/noun. And we got an error. And so this is also an easy fix. It's telling me, and let me go ahead and let's make everything bigger and get rid of the sidebar so we can keep Thunder Client, but also debug our code. It's telling me assertion error, expected a response, HTTP response, or streaming HTTP response. Right? From my request, if I look at the bottom of the error message, it doesn't give me a file number, but if I scroll up, let's see if it actually gives us a file number. Morad, yes, sir.
Shall we return the HTTP response or just print would be enough?
Yeah, we absolutely have to return a response, and we absolutely should use this response class from Django REST framework. I just wanted to see if there was a spot in the error message that would actually give us the line of code in the file, because it's a little more buried. But this error message is actually pretty friendly, and the advantage of running code as you go is I know there's only like so many places where I could have made this mistake. Just to put this error here in the browser so we can see what it would look like. Right, we would have seen assertion error API/v1/noun. And so if nothing else, this tells me the route that has the problem. And I know this is the view class, the API view associated with the route. So this is probably where my bug is. And indeed, we actually need to return this response, and we should probably, just for now, let's just return response true, just to get this working. And then in a moment, we can investigate and see what we want to send back. And I'm going to go ahead and clear the terminal here. And let's make this request again with noun project. And I could do it again here in the browser, but we have this up and running, so I think we're good to go. So let's just put that off to the side. And we've got our print statement, right? I added that print statement in the view function right over here. And so this is what we're actually getting back from the noun project. And this is a lot of stuff. We see here it's JSON, but it's still a string, and this is not so easy for Python to work with. So let's do a little bit of work so that we can get this JSON in a nice format, like maybe say a dictionary or something like that, that we can actually print out and manipulate. And the request library does that for us. And let's print that out instead. And actually, I'll use the browser this time to make my request. Let's give us a little more room so we can see it. And it looks like I just forgot a closing parentheses on line 17. And let me clear out the terminal here so we get a nice message and go ahead and refresh. Right. Our HTTP response isn't sending back anything very interesting, but right now we're just debugging and testing out this API. And with my print statement, now I have a Python dictionary that I can work with that's much more useful. And it looks like it's maybe this thumbnail URL key that we care about. Earl John, yes, sir.
I just want to clarify something. So like in the .json, is that just saying that to make the response into a JSON format?
Not quite. What and the name is a little counterintuitive. What it's doing is, so remember there's two parts to every HTTP request and response, really three. There's like the URL, there's all the different headers, right? And then there's the body, right? Where if I'm submitting a form, that form data is in the body. When we get this HTTP response back from the noun project, the body of that HTTP request has a bunch of text in JSON format. What response.json does is, hey, if that response body has JSON in it, let's turn it into a Python dictionary. Let's handle the JSON in the response. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, great question. So in fact, we could even rename this, I think, a bit more accurately to, like, you'll sometimes just hear like response data. You'll see response data being used as a name for this kind of stuff. So we're taking the JSON from the response body, we're turning it into a Python dictionary. And it might be interesting to return response data.get. And now I have to scroll all the way back up to see again where it was hiding. Thumbnail URL, I think, is the key. Let's see if that works for us. And I think I'm actually just going to. So in fact, this is a bit. We'll see in a minute how we can kind of print some of this stuff out more nicely. I think I'm going to hop over to the docs for a moment because it is a little hard for me to see, like, where is the thumbnail image that I want to grab. And I'm going to, in fact, just make this exactly the same. Let's just use an ID of 1. And let me make sure that I'm grabbing the thumbnail image from the right spot. And it looks like thumbnail URL is hiding inside some other object in our JSON. If I keep going up, it looks like it's hiding in icon. So I think we need to get icon and then thumbnail URL. So let's try that. And go back to now. Let's do a little debugging here. So there's thumbnail URL. I'm not sure why my method chaining wasn't working. but we can debug this more in a minute to get the actual bit that we want. Actually, there it is. It was just hiding from me. It is indeed working. So let's clean this up a bit. So we'll kind of see some ways to print this out more nicely, but just to recap, the JSON we got back was pretty nested, so I had to do a little poking around. And there's a JSON object with the key of icon, and inside that is the thumbnail URL key, and that has the actual URL with the image that we care about. And so now I'm printing that and hopefully returning that in my response. And we see that right here. So now if we had a React app, our React app could go ahead and render whatever the heck that is, right? A person throwing something out. Earl John, yes, sir.
So if we just return the response underscore data itself, it's just gonna return us the whole object.
That is correct. Yeah. I was pulling up the inspect tab so we can see here in network. Yeah, so the noun API itself, we were printing out response data. And, you know, if we go to the noun API docs, we can see it sends back this whole big JSON object, right? And we don't care about all this information. Sometimes we might need more of it, but a lot of the times you only care about a little bit of it. So this is one of the advantages too of having our Django backend talk to a third-party API is when our React app talks to our Django API that we write, our Django API can do all the messy work and just send back exactly what our React app needs. Does that make sense, Iljan?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, great question. Okay, let's do a little more writing of code and then take a break. We do have the retro coming up at 11, but we've covered a lot of ground. Actually, this might be a good time for a break. Up next is showing how to not hard code these secrets so that they are actually saved. Why don't we take a 5-minute break and then dive into that? And then I think we'll try to take like another short 5-minute break along the way. Does that sound good to folks? Perfect. Yeah, I apologize. We're not taking a longer break, but I want to make sure we kind of cover everything we need to. And I think we're making good ground. So thank you very much, everyone. Take 5, get away from the screen. And in 5 minutes, we'll see how to hide our secrets. All right, so just to recap, we've talked about kind of the big picture conceptual overview of how to have our Django backend, our Django server interact with third-party APIs and why. We've looked at the Noun project. We've seen how to explore a third party's API documentation and how to use with the Noun project an OAuth like an API key and secret we get when we create an account to authenticate. And we've seen how to create our own API endpoint for our Django API that our React app can use that under the hood talks to the Noun project or whatever other API we want, right? And we got all of that hooked up and working. And indeed, we've seen we get a whole lot of data back from the Noun project, but we might not want to use all of it. And so we've grabbed one of the bits that we wanted. The next step is it's not ideal that I have these secrets, the key and the secret hard coded. Because as we discussed, if it's in the source code, it's vulnerable. If it gets into GitHub, that's a real problem. So there's a couple best practices around this and sort of industry standards and conventions. Let me make sure I'm in the right directory right now. I'm in the root directory of my Django project, the same directory where the manage.py file is, right? And let me go ahead and close all this other stuff out so we can see this here as well. The way you handle API keys is in the root directory of your Django project. We're going to make a file named .env. And we call this a dot file because it starts with a dot. Now the name is really similar to the .venv for the Python virtual environment if you've named it that way. Completely different purpose. The environment that we're referring here is our command line, the shell. Where on the command line, we can create in variables, and we call it the shell environment, right? The bash shell or the ZSH shell. And these are environment variables. And so sometimes we might actually have the key be an environment variable for like a server that's actually running on the cloud in production. But often what we do is instead we put that in a file and we'll read that file. And that's what the .env file is. Because we never want those secrets in our GitHub and version control, we also need to create a .gitignore file, which we use to tell Git to ignore this file and never check it into version control. So in my .gitignore, I'm going to add to it the name of the .env file so that Git will ignore it. And this is all, again, in the same directory where manage.py is in the root of our Django project, the root directory of our Django project. Now let's open up the env file. And let's add a couple things in here. Let's add noun API key. And let me actually go and I'm just going to copy this stuff. And kind of do with the Vim keyboard bindings that I have, kind of get rid of the stuff I don't want real quick, just to clean it up a bit. And I don't believe we need quotes here. Don't quote me on that, but I'm about 90% sure. And noun API secret. And the convention, as you can see, for these shell environment variables is to always name them in all caps. So now these live in that file because of the .gitignore. If I type get status, the .env file is being ignored. Now we need to use another Python library, and I've kind of pulled it up over here, and its name is python-.env to grab these values from this file. So I'm going to pip install python.env. I'm going to move my requirements.txt file into my root directory, and I'm going to update it again with pip freeze. Now that we've installed this, we actually need to do some work in the settings PY of our whole Django project, and you should just do this up at the top. By the way, what we can also do is this Django secret key that there's this big comment, security warning, keep the secret key used in production secret. When we deploy, we actually don't want this here in settings PY. We want this in the .env file as well. For now, I'm just going to make a to-do note to myself, and we can always do this later. Just because in the interest of time, I don't want to change too many things at once. But the exact same way we're going to access those other variables from that .env file, we could do this here. Often things like even debug are in the .env file, because then you can have one .env for your local development where debug is true, and a different one for production where debug is false, and we don't have to change settings PY. Let's go ahead and let's import the .env library that we just installed. And from it, we need to import this function dot env values. And what this does is this grabs that .env file that we created and turns it into what Python calls an ordered dictionary. Which is basically a dictionary. Because now what I can do is I can do stuff like env.get, secret key. And so what we're going to do over here in our views for the noun project, our noun project API view is from that settings py file, since every Python file is also a module. And let me make sure I get this import path right, because we need to start with Pokédex proj.settings. We can just import env. And that's a dictionary with all of our environment keys. And now what I can do here is auth equals OAuth1 env.get, and I believe it was noun API key, and env.get noun API secret. And let me make sure I have my names right. I do have my names right. Let's go ahead and start the server again. No errors, which is always a good sign. Let's use Thunder Client this time around. And it still works and nothing broke. So we now have successfully taken our secret key values out of our source code and put them in the .env file. And in fact, we might as well go ahead and do this now for the Django secret key. So what we're going to do is we're going to do something like, actually, we'll come back. I don't want to mess around with that too much because I might get something wrong, and there's some other things I want to cover as well. But that can be moved in there. And I believe it would look just like this. And in fact, we might as well make that change now that I've been talking about it so much. So we're just going to grab this, cut it out of here. And put it right there. And I am just going to get rid of those quotes at the beginning and the end. And so now we're grabbing that from the environment. We can get rid of our to-do. Let's restart our server, see if that worked. Let's test it again with a request to make sure everything's working. And we're golden. In fact, we can even move that debug from URLs py into our .env. And I can name it whatever I want. I'm just putting Django at the front to help me keep track of what's for what. I think that should do it. That one we'll leave for later because I don't want to get too lost in this. So let me just pause and check in and see what questions folks have around this change that we just made now to put our secrets in an .env file. People feeling pretty good about it? Brandon, yes, sir.
Can we go over using get ignore on env or
Yeah.
.env?
Absolutely. So, and the good news is that's pretty straightforward. Easiest way to do it is I create a file named .getignore in the same directory where the .env file is. And inside here, literally on every line, I just have a list of the files and directories that I want to ignore. And I just put the name of that file, and that's all we have to do.
So so basically everything inside of .venv will be ignored.
Correct. And that's my Python virtual environment directory, which is why I want to ignore it by Git. And you can have a lot of .git ignore files in your project. You don't have to have just one. Murad, yes, sir. I know you had a question as well.
No, I got everything, but if you can just go through it in 1 minute, like quick review.
I think I need to move on in just a minute. I don't want
Okay,
to do
no
general
problem.
review. Yeah, but we'll have an opportunity to later. Mikhail, yes, sir.
And the difference between a file and a directory is the / after the name for directory.
To be honest, the git ignore file doesn't care. It will figure it out. I added that just now because I like to do that to remind me that this is a directory and not a file.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. If there was like a specific file that we wanted to ignore in here, we need to do it this way, but the .git ignore file will do just fine. I just like to do that so I can tell what's a directory or not. Eric, yes, sir.
So if this information is not going on GitHub and a developer team needed to like share the keys, how would they go about doing that in a secure way?
Great question. The answer is you use like a password manager like LastPass or Bitbucket, or there's a whole bunch of sort of solutions out there for like securely sharing secrets and API keys and stuff. Like at places I've worked at, like when I joined the team, I'd get a LastPass account and like in there would be API keys and stuff. People also sometimes share them in Slack and delete the message, which is obviously not actually secure, but like, you know, unless we're being targeted by malicious people because we're Google or something for like a little startup, that's not the end of the world, but you should use a password manager. Yeah, great question. Okay, awesome. So there's a little more ground to cover here. Let me kind of pull up our README and we can kind of see the other things we have lined up. And in fact, let's go ahead and delete these now that that's in my .env file. So let's see a bit more about how to format responses. We'll kind of see how to make this a bit more useful. So maybe our API endpoint could actually like, you know, because everything is hard coded now. I'm just getting that trash can icon back every time. That's not that useful. And then let's look a little bit at testing. So let's talk a little bit about formatting, because I did run into some pain points there and there is some stuff that's useful to see. Let me hop over to our view. So as you remember, you know, I was printing out this response data before, and it was kind of tough to read it. You know, I was kind of like scrolling through there and I ended up going to, in fact, the docs. And actually, Python has a very useful library called PrettyPrint. And I think I'm going to put this up here. What I try to do is I like to have like Python imports, Django lib imports, and then like project imports. It's kind of like how I try to organize my world more or less. And so from Python, we can import a module called PrettyPrint. And as this VS Code sort of doc pop-up indicates, we can use it to pretty print lists, tuples, and dictionaries recursively. Very simple, but useful, especially in debugging data structures, like say, massive JSON objects from the Noun API. And that's exactly what we're going to do right now. So the way we have to use PrettyPrint is we do have to configure our pretty printer. And we only are going to go 2 levels deep into the JSON. So what we do is we say pprint dot pretty printer. We can give it some indentation rules, how deeply we want to indent, and then depth is where we're telling it how deep we want to go. And then here, I'll use my pretty printer to print out the response data. And I do pp.pprint response data. So let's spin up our Django server, use Thunder client to hit our endpoint and see what this looks like. Server is running, always a good sign. Right? And so now with the pretty print, we get a much more useful printing out of that dictionary. So this is really nice to have when debugging. And in fact, we can see inside here that I might have jumped the gun in terms of what URL we want to grab, because now I can see, okay, there's this property icon, and inside there is another dict, but inside there is something that's icon URL. So let's try maybe doing it this way. Instead of .get, we can use the bracket notation if we want. .get is a little safer, but we also know this information will be there. Let's do Thunder client again. We see that printed out. We get this in our response. Let's see what this URL is. And I didn't grab the whole thing. So let's try that one more time. I'm probably grabbing the quotes, which is part of the problem. And all right, there we go. Sorry about that. There we go. So same thing, but this might be a better place to grab it from, but now we can more cleanly see our data and work with it. So now what would be really useful is to not always get the trash can, right? But to actually be able to get different stuff. So let's see how to modify our view function to actually grab different things. If I hop over to the noun project interactive API, and we look over here, this query that we did before, this kind of looks what I want. I don't care about this next page stuff. Let's get rid of that. But you know, this is useful, right? I can search for different things and get one thing back, like say maybe different kinds of Pokemon. So let's modify our view function to hit that endpoint. So it's v2/icon, but we're going to need to pass some data in. And like we learned yesterday, this get method is going to need to take an argument. And we'll call it name, because what we're going to use this for is like different kinds of Pokemon, like a fire Pokemon or a water Pokemon, and so on and so forth, which to be honest, I always get confused with the Pokemon moves, but it all kind of comes out to the same in the end. And everything after the question mark in a URL is called a query parameter, where you have a key, and the key here has to be query, which is a pretty common convention, and a value. And in our case, the value is what we are going to pass in. Each query parameter is separated by an ampersand, like that. And the next one, limit equals 1, I'm going to hard code because I want the behavior of my endpoint to be to just get the one thing. Now that I've done that, I do have to make a change to my URLs PY. Could someone maybe remind me what that change is? What do I have to change over here? Brandon, yes, sir.
You have to be able to take an argument in the URL.
Yeah, exactly. My path, I need to tell Django there's going to be an argument in this URL. And I maybe should have specified that this is the direction we were going in. It should look like that. And Brandon, can you actually help me modify this request in Thunder Client? What should this URL look like now to test out our newly modified endpoint?
It should take a. Could you go back to the views?
Yeah, absolutely.
It should look exactly like that, but instead of name, it should have a name.
Yeah, close. Very close. The way we designed ours, we're not doing it as a query parameter. We'll learn to do that later. We're just putting the name in the URL. So in fact, let me put fire right there. And in fact, let me go ahead. Can I split? Does it let me split? Indeed, we can split. Right, our URL, we're putting the name in the path. We're then putting it in the query param for Django. And let's see here. And it looks like it doesn't like my response. It looks like we might get a different kind of data back. But our request works. So let's do a little bit of debugging. Let me pull up the view code. And we see this stuff get printed here where we get icons. And so maybe the issue here is in my code, it said icon singular, but it's sending many back. So let's try changing this to icons and see what happens now. And my guess is we'll still get an error. But we can, in fact, this is where the docs kind of can be our friend. We have the exact same request here, and we can kind of scroll down and find the bit that we want. And so maybe I do need to go back to grabbing that thumbnail URL because we see icons, right? I'm not seeing the thumbnail URL anywhere inside icons. But I am seeing it. I am seeing it inside the very first icon object, right? Icons is an array, and it's got this one big object inside of it. Then we have creator. This is honestly, I think, always the hardest part. So let's just try. Yeah, I think it is inside icons at that top level where pretty print can help. But let's try icons and grabbing the first thing and thumbnail URL, and we can do a little bit of debugging as we go. And for now, I'll just kind of return, we'll leave the response as is. But let's try maybe something like that and change this to thumbnail URL. And we'll test that out in just a second and see how we do. And now that's working for us. So this is, I think, is one of the challenges of working with third-party APIs is you spend half your time doing stuff like this. But now we should have an icon of fire. And if I want to test it out, get water. We can get back water, and just copying this, I apologize, is a little bit of a pain. But that looks right. And we get water. So just to recap, right? Because we covered a lot of ground here. Our API, our Django API we are putting the name of the thing we want in the URL, right? As a part of the URL, as a parameter in the URL. Our API pattern here is API/v1/noun, and then the noun that we want, water, earth, fire, and so on. The noun project API works a little differently. They need us to pass, and let me pull up the Zoom annotation tool. They need us to pass the name in a query param after the question mark. So this URL, this endpoint that we use to interact with the noun API is constructed differently from ours. So I just want to pause and check in and see if that makes sense to folks and what questions people have, because I think that's a key point. Can I get a couple of thumbs up, thumb downs, maybe like somewhere in the middle, just to kind of see where we're at? Awesome. Seeing a number of thumbs up, loving it. Good stuff, right? So now we have an endpoint where we can get all these different nouns, say for like the different kinds of our Pokemon, which is awesome. There's a couple changes we can make to our Pokemon as a part of this. Like it'd be cool to give Pokemon types. I also want to show testing. We're also starting to run a little tight on time. So I think what I'm going to do is very quickly show building out our model a bit more, because I think that's useful to see, and then we'll see how far we can get with tests. So let's kind of see some ways that we can, in interesting ways that we can modify our Pokemon model now that we're here. So for one thing, we can give our Pokemon a type of earth, fire, water, air, and so on. And I think I'll just leave that as is off to the side. Let's look at our Pokemon model and let's give them a type. So here in the Pokemon app, I'm just going to pull up the model for my Pokemon. And now our Pokemon can have some types. And it should be a char field. Its default value should be the Pokemon is of the normal type. And we are going to want to give some validators here, because that will be useful, because I want the types to be nouns from the noun project API. And I'm going to write a custom validation function, validate type. So this function doesn't exist yet. We're about to create it. But let's go ahead and we're applying it, and let's go ahead and import it, because we know we're going to make it in just a moment. And now let's open up that validators function from before, and let's write a new validation function for our Pokemon to validate its type. And let me bring this out of the way. And let's write our validate type logic up here. And we're going to make a list of allowed types that are all going to be nouns. Normal needs to be one of them. There's a bug Pokemon type, ghost, one of my favorite types, fire, water, grass, electric, right? There's psychic Pokemons. I think there's a steel Pokemon. And that's a pretty good list right there. Now we need to actually do some validation logic. If this value for a possible Pokemon type, and let's lowercase it, is not in the list of allowed types, we need to throw our error. And let's give the user some useful information. Let's give them a list of all the allowed types with a little bit of the cool stuff that Python can do with manipulating lists very nicely. And we're going to do sort of a join on a comma and do a join on allowed types. And I'm going to make sure I close out the parentheses and the double quote on that F string. And so this will print out a list of all the allowed types separated by commas. And now we should have a validator for our Pokemon allowed types. I'm going to do a quick sanity check to make sure I haven't broken anything. I'm also going to update my migrations because I've changed the model. So I have to run the make migration command. And indeed, good news, Django is going to create a type for us for our Pokemon. And the migration's been applied. And as a sanity check, I am going to open up Thunder Client. And I'm going to hit our Pokemon endpoint. To make sure that it still works. And indeed it does. Now I'm not seeing the type show up in the serializer. So let's look at our Pokemon serializer. Here's the list of fields we want the serializer to return. And types is not in that list. So we have to modify the Pokemon serializer now that we've added this new field to it. So let's go ahead and add types. And this should just give us a list of all the types belonging to that Pokemon. And now I've got my Pokemon types, right? Normal and so on, which is awesome. At this point, I apologize. We are not going to realistically have enough time to get into writing tests. I think what we will have to do is find time after lunch to finish this off because we have our retro in 5 minutes. So let me pause the recording and let's take a short break and then we'll reconvene for retro. The good news here is we've covered pretty much everything we wanted to. I think covering the last bit of testing is going to be pretty straightforward and a pretty light lift. Let me go ahead and stop the recording. All right, so in the earlier part of the lesson, just to recap, and let me go ahead and navigate back into my lesson directory, where we now have 3 apps, right? The API app, the Move app, and the Pokemon app. And we also have, in fact, as long as I'm on the command line, our .ignore directory to ignore the stuff we don't want to put into version control, and our .env file, which now has the API secrets that we use to authenticate against the Noun API, which is really nice because it's really only a few lines of code. Now, we did have to do a little bit of setup in settings py to use python.env. But once we've done that, it's very straightforward and easy to use. And now our API has an endpoint, right? I can go to localhost 8000 /API/v1/noun/water. And as soon as I run the server, and that must have, there we go. And we get back a URL from the Noun project, which, as we saw, we had to do a little digging in the response data JSON to get. And we converted that response data JSON to a Python dictionary here. In fact, I should probably be a bit safer and do a .get, because .get will, I believe, return null if it doesn't find what it wants, which seems a bit safer than just throwing an error. And we can do .get for thumbnail as well. And fingers crossed, I haven't broken my code. We're still good and it's a little more secure. So let's talk about how to test this, right? Because the bigger and more complex our code gets, the better and nicer and happier life is when we have tests. So we have a tests.py file here in our API app. And this is where we're going to write this test. And this is going to be more of a unit test. And the reason is it's nice to not have to depend on like the noun project API to run these tests. Because what if the noun project API is down and then our tests fail? That's not ideal. Also, what if, we're paying for access to this API and it increases our costs like every time we run a test? So this is one of several reasons. Also because it can take longer to actually make the API call as part of the test, why we don't always want to do a full end-to-end test, right? And this is more of a unit test, a backend unit test, or maybe a backend integration test, depending on how you look at it. Because we're going to test that we send a request to our API, but we're going to fake the noun API. So let's see what that looks like. So we've already imported the unit test case. And let me go ahead and close out most of the things that we don't need here, like this env file. These other ones we might come back to. I'll put models over here. I kind of like to organize my files left to right the more and more time I spend with my code. And the more and more complex it gets. So we're going to need to import from the unit test library a function called patch. That's going to let us fake the API call. And we'll use patch in a bit to fake the API call to the noun project. We need to import from Django REST framework from its testing module API client to also help us test it. And just like with our other tests, this test is a class. So let's use proper camel case naming. Let's call it noun project test, and it's going to inherit from test case. We're going to write a setup method, just like we did with tests yesterday. And can someone maybe remind me, what does this setup method do? And what is this self.client that I'm creating right here? What is the purpose of self.client and of the setup method? So there's a hint in the name, right? What is client? What does a client usually do? A client makes a request. Daniel, yes, sir.
Is this setup sort of like Cypress, where we're instead of setting up our own, instead of going manually and going live to our server, it just automatically sets it up for us?
Close. So just like with testing views, I actually want to make an HTTP request to my Django server, to my endpoint. I'm not going to use Thunder client to do it, and I'm not going to use the browser as my client to do it. I'm going to use this little Python class called API client. So when we run this tests, API client right here that we create is actually going to send an HTTP request to our Django server, which the test will also run for us. We don't have to have it running, unlike with Cypress. And then setup just does this at the beginning of every test in this class, so that I don't have to repeat this step for each of the tests that we're about to write, if we have like 2 or 3 different tests. Does that make sense to folks and kind of help explain a bit what's going on with self.client, if that rings any bells from like kind of testing views and stuff the other day? I think that's something it might be worth like a little bit of a diagram later. Though what we can do, I think, is a quick tail draw. And we're going to use everyone's favorite words, client and server, and everyone's favorite arrows for an HTTP request and an HTTP response. Right. And let's say the HTTP request is get, API / v1 / noun / water. And the response is, this, 200, okay. And this text, which I want to take up this room. And we'll just put the server kind of a little further over there. Right, and that's a request and a response. Now the client could be my browser, it could be Thunder client, or in this case, it could be this program here that's going to be run by our test file. And so this is actually going to happen when we run these tests. The test is actually going to start up Django server. It's actually going to make an HTTP request and get the response back. So let's keep building this sucker. We're not going to eat the whole meal on this, but we're going to write up parts of it. I write a method for my test name, and we'll call it test, maybe Pokeball image API view. Though I think I'll need to make sure that my test actually does include a Pokeball as its type. So let me actually double check my code before I start writing this test to make sure that I'm working with the right data before I get too far down that road. Yeah, though actually I think we're okay. I apologize. We're not going to be hitting like our model validation and stuff. So basically what this test is going to do is we are going to test that our code creates a correct HTTP request to send to the noun API. Test that when we hit our endpoints, get API v1 noun, that our code creates a correct HTTP response to send to the noun API, but we are not actually sending anything to noun API. So that's the plan here. And we're going to test it. We're going to test just by getting an image of a Pokeball. And the test takes self as an argument. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but we need to pass in a sort of mock function for getting the HTTP request, right? Because I don't actually want to send an HTTP request. I also need to tell my code, hey, don't send an HTTP request to the noun API. And the way we do that is we use this decorator from way back in week 2 called patch. And we give it the name of the method we're going to fake. And we're faking requests.get. right? Because if I take a look at my code and let's make a little split here. And let's do, I think, a split left. And over here on the right is the views, and I'll just get rid of everything else that we don't need right now. And this should in fact be views. Right here, line 20. That's where the Python requests library makes an HTTP GET request. This is what we're faking right here. We're telling our test code that we are going to fake that. When the code gets the message, hey, tell the requests library to make a GET request, we're actually going to do something else. We don't actually want to make that HTTP GET request. So that's what that patch decorator does right there. And let me get rid of these annotations. There you go. And we're just gonna make a variable for the noun that we want to get. We're gonna see if the noun API has a Pokeball. Image we want from noun API. I actually probably should see what the noun API has for a Pokeball. Right, and so here, this is good. I can see the URL that I'm supposed to get back, the nounproject.com png 200.png. Let's look a little more in detail. Let's look at, and let me clear the server here and make this request again. Let's look at the response from the noun API, because this is what we have to fake. Right, I have to fake a good chunk of this JSON object. Though actually, I guess depending on what we have in our API, we may not have to fake anything right now, because I think all I'm sending back is here. So I apologize, I got a little off track there. At the moment, all we need to fake is what we send back right here on line 31. And right now, all we send back on line 31 is a URL. So I believe right now this is all we need to fake. So I'm just going to grab this and we'll call this the preview URL and bring these up here. And now let's write out a bit more code. And this is where, in fact, the mocking and the faking comes into play. So we need to do a little bit of faking here of what the noun API is sending us back. And this part does always get a little tricky for me. I think some of this is probably going to be wrong, and then we'll go back and fix it, but we can see what it's doing. And then I think going back and fixing it will be easier. We need to fake the response from the noun API. And we do this with a Python function named type that actually creates a class for us. We're actually going to create an instance of a class named mock response. And what we need to do here is basically kind of mimic what the Python request library sends back to us. And if we go into our view code to look at that and print it out, that's probably the easiest way to do it. And that's kind of where I'm pulling this from. So some of this we might need to tweak because of the API that we're hitting, and because there's different endpoints on the noun API, and this one returns an awful lot of stuff, as we saw. But let me kind of write this out so we can see the code, and then we can tweak it as needed. So this is like a simulation of the JSON we get back from the noun API. And this is the bit that I might need to go back and tweak. And in part, we need to fake it with a Lambda, because that's how this mock response stuff works with the unit test and Django test. And let me make sure I have all the correct ordering of curly brackets. Yeah, and in fact, no, we should leave it all in there because it's, I think, confusing enough as is. So this is basically generating a mock response class. Which will return basically, I'm not sure if it returns Python or a Python dictive JSON, but simulating what requests get would actually return if we hit the noun API. And so here, we can say response equals self.client, right? And we're making this HTTP call, self.client.get. And here we have to do the reverse stuff from the other day. And let me make sure that I have reverse imported in this test library, because I may not. Yep, so let me go ahead and import reverse. And let me actually double check. I remember which place to import reverse from. We import reverse from Django.urls. And we give it the name of our path. And in fact, let me open up a split. And let's take a look at our URLs PY for the API app. And let's see the name that we gave it. Right, so this path has the name noun project. Whoa, sorry about that. So reverse gets us that URL self, and then the client makes an HTTP GET request to it. Now we also need to pass an argument for the query param for name, right? So we can do args equals, and we have to pass it a list, and we'll pass it ball. In fact, we could just say Pokeball right here if we wanted. We pass it the name we want from the noun API. And so now when I run this, it's not actually going to hit the noun API. The test code will use this mock response sort of class magic that we've put together and return some JSON just like what the noun API would return. And that's the one bit we might have to tweak a bit. Let's finish writing the assertions of the test, and then we can run it and see what we need to revise. So let's just test that the endpoint is correct, that our client talks to our Django server, that our Django server sends our test client a response. Let's test that our Django API endpoint returns a 200 HTTP response, HTTP response with code 200 success. And we're going to use that subtest method that lets us put a test inside a test to do self.assert equal response status code is 200. And now let's write the other part of our test. Let's test that our API returns the correct data in the correct format. And again, we'll do a self-assert equal. And we'll look at, we can, actually, I'm going to need to import the JSON module as well, because we need to turn the fake response JSON into something real. And let's use that Python JSON module to do JSON.loads, response content, and compare it to what we're expecting that content to be, which is the preview URL. And let's give this test a run and see how we do. Right? So what we're hoping happens is I run the test. This makes an HTTP request to my Django API, right? With the word Pokeball. So the test should literally do this. Or if we were using Thunder Client would do that same thing. In fact, we can pull up Thunder Client now just for fun. So our test should literally make this HTTP request to our Django API server. Our test fakes what the noun API would do and sends this back. And this is the part that I may need to tweak. And then our Django API sends back to our test client an HTTP response. And we're hoping for a 200 success code. And then we should see the preview URL. So let's see how we did. Let's run this test and see what happens. And the curriculum for today does walk through this in depth, as you can see, and walks through each of these pieces. So I do think this is good to read through. And I'm pretty darn sure that I should be able to go to, I should just be able to run Python manage py test. Excuse me. So it looks like there's a couple issues here. The first one was not the issue I was expecting. If I look at this error, it says Django URLs exceptions, no reverse match, reverse for noun project with no arguments not found. One pattern tried API/v1/noun/name. So I think I may just have screwed up and my guide code may be slightly different from what we wrote this morning. I think this is a relatively easy fix. What this error is telling us is that this reverse step failed, but noun project should be right. It tried this, but I believe the way we wrote the code this morning, I'm not sure if I need to pass this as an arg or I think, or not. So I think the arg part is what I got wrong here. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to pull up as a reference my test code that we wrote yesterday, because I think that's going to be the quickest and simplest way to debug this. And let's see what we did here. So we create a client. We make a call to all Pokemon. This is the test that's commented out from yesterday, but this is doing the exact same thing, except we don't have to fake calling another API. So it looks like I'm using the right syntax here. In fact, I'm going to simplify this test. Let's let's just put the thing that we're looking for right there. Let's just get rid of that. And I think I see the mistake that I made comparing these two lines of code. So this is actually a pretty easy mistake to make. This is a good one to see. If I look at my test from yesterday, reverse takes 2 arguments, right? The path that we want and args. Everyone see what I mean with between where I'm hopping with my cursor? I kind of made a goof here. I only passed reverse 1 arg, and I'm passing the self.client.get like 2 arguments. So that was a pretty simple syntax error on my part, and it has a pretty easy fix. Which is now reverse takes 2 arguments like it should. We just need a comma there. And now, fingers crossed, we should see a better error next time we run this test. So good news is we solved that error. Bad news is, oh, good, it did fail. The worst thing is if a test doesn't fail and return an error. Bad news is this second error may be harder to figure out. This part of the error message, recursion error maximum recursion depth received while calling a Python object. We're actually about to learn and talk about recursion in just a minute, which means I do think we'll need to wrap up. But basically, this means some sort of infinite loop occurred, and then the test stopped itself. And so I'm unsure what would cause that infinite loop, though my suspicion does lie in like the with statement here and the subtest. So I think I'm just going to comment that out. And let's just try this with the 1, and let's see if we get the same error. And it looks like we're going to because it is hanging. So we can see we get to the point of making our mock response. We can see we make, yeah, but I'm not quite sure what's introducing the error here, and this may not be the right time to dig into it and debug. Though actually this is a bit of a hint right here, this get and this get item stuff. It makes me wonder if like because I have this formatted kind of weird, if that's the problem. I think there's one last thing we'll try and then we'll switch gears. Let's go back to our view code for the noun API. Let's print out the actual response data that we get from this API call. Right? Because that's really what we're looking at here. Or even better, we might want to print, yeah, let's start with the response data. And so I think maybe I just need to copy and paste that. Oh, it's not, I want to run the server, not the test. So I suspect the issue may be here, and this will give us pretty accurate fake data anyway. So I'm just going to create a variable named response JSON and paste all that stuff in as that massive response JSON object and get rid of all of this whole dictionary right here and put in response JSON. And let's see what happens now when we run our test, if that does it or not. Oh. Yeah, so that definitely is not solving the issue because we're gonna see the same hanging. So I do apologize, folks. I will debug this offline and figure out what's going on. But we got to at least see parts of how to test and fake this out. I suspect the issue is maybe here in terms of how I'm constructing the mock response. But we got some reps and sets in on writing tests that actually hit our API endpoints using self.client.get. We actually had some good debugging here. And then some comparison between the two. The one other thing we could try is, I don't think this is the issue because I'm pretty sure the issue is with the response, but we could just test the status code. Yeah, so the fact that this assertion is doing the simplest possible thing, and the fact that the error we were getting was over here before, which means the code got to at least line 30 of the test, tells me that the problem is almost definitely in how I'm constructing this mock response and something going on with that, right? Because we know that the code gets to this point. We know that it's generating a mock response, and this magic mock stuff right here is kind of a hint to that. But then something is going wrong and we're getting in an infinite loop, and I don't want to debug that one live, so to speak. So I'll follow up with what the correction there is, but the main thing I think is seeing this idea of mocking an API response and why that's important. So I just want to check in and see if folks have any questions or things that it might be good to review, and then we can take a short break and then we can look at recursion, which is a total switching of gears, though totally unintended. But actually, we will talk about what maximum recursion depth means when we talk about recursion. So that actually there's a little synchronicity there. Okay, cool, folks. Thank you. Let's do this. Let's take 5. Let's see, it's 1:41. Let's do this. Take 9 minutes at 10 till. Come back. We'll look at recursion. Sound good? Awesome. Thank you very much, everyone, and I'll see you all in 9 minutes.